do a roundtable on the Washington Naval Agreements, Washington Naval Treaty, which is, of course, 100th anniversary. And we put together this discussion group. I've asked them to talk about what they think the most important aspects of the treaty were, and whether it had a lasting impact on the future, and particularly on the coming of World War II, and perhaps even today with our world, which we call great power competition. Before we begin, let's see if I have any more comments to make. No, but for our panelists, I want to show you what you are missing. After your discussion, we are going to cut the anniversary cake for the Washington Naval Treaty, properly sized for Britain, US, and Japan 553, and also the proper color codes on the war plans, which is red, blue, orange. We also have cupcakes for Italy and France. And we all know that the color code, oh, Carl's pointing the cupcakes. We all know that the color code for France, I can't hold it. So we all know that the color code for France was gold, but nobody can remember what the color code for Italy was. So if anybody can come up with that, or we'll do that. So let me introduce we're going to go in the order of Kori Schake first. Yum. Kori Schake first, and then we go with Emily Goldman and Carlos. Carlos, you get to be last because you're a board member, and yes. So I'll talk to you very briefly. Kori Schake, I met some years ago at the Hoover Institution. She is a national security professional, a defense scholar. Right now, she's at the American Enterprise Institute, where she is leading their defense policy studies, foreign and defense policy studies. And in particular for this panel, she's a recent author of Safe Passage, The Transition from British to American Hegemony. And of course, she relates that to possible events in the future. Dr. Emily Goldman has a very unique position. She is a strategist at US Cyber Command. And she did lead what the equivalent of the commander US Cyber Command's action group, which is does those immediate tasks. But previously, she was a scholar. I mean, she still is a scholar. She is a professor, and she's the author of Sunken Treaties: Naval Arms Control Between the Wars. So she will talk from that perspective. I asked her to talk about the arms control aspects of whether this set a precedent today. And our own Carlos Rivera teaches history at Ohio State University and other university and colleges in Ohio, where he is, known as Carlos of Coronado because he was here. And I hear that you are still searching for the spring on North Island, the original spring. Did you find it, Carlos? Okay. And he's a charter member of Western Naval History Association. So with that, let us begin. Kori, would you like to begin the remarks?
I would be delighted to. Thank you so much for having this intensive conversation about the Washington Naval Accords, my friends. I think it is the most important milestone early in the 20th century about great power competition. And it's so frequently overlooked. And despite all of the criticism of President Wilson and his damaging idealism with the League of Nations, that damaging idealism was actually practiced much more effectually by his Republican successor, Warren G. Harding. Because what Harding achieves at Washington in 1922 is a changing of the rules, a set of treaties to voluntarily restrain the means of war, achieved by diplomacy conducted in public. And I think most important for the purposes of this conversation is that it also marks the moment at which Great Britain cedes primacy to the United States, right? You guys know a lot about the treaty, so you know about the 5 to 5 to 3 to 1 to 1. and that they were a series of interlocking treaties to contain great power competition in East Asia. Harding's administration believed the treaties would prevent war, cost less, and have more public appeal than the continued naval building programs. So you'll recall that in the 1916 Naval Act planned to build an American Navy within a decade at a cost of $500 million. It's, Alfred Thayer Mahan's dream come true. And within the first 3 years, the act appropriated funds for the construction of 10 battleships, 6 battle cruisers, 10 scout cruisers, and 50 destroyers. Wilson had explicitly made his argument to Americans for support of the League of Nations as the only alternative to building a navy second to none. But when Harding brought forward the spending bills to continue the 1916 naval program, the bill was only approved in the Senate with an amendment advocating for a 50% reduction in shipbuilding by the US, Britain, and Japan as an alternative the president should pursue. And Harding realized that flagging support for the aggressive shipbuilding program, he felt it ebbing, so he bartered it away. And what he got in return was equality with the world's dominant maritime power, the containment of Japan's rise, reduced threat of Anglo-Japanese cooperation. The president drew worldwide acclaim for his opening statement in public at the conference in December of 1921, that our 100 millions want less of armament and none of war. But of course, the Washington Naval Accords have no verification provisions. And so another thing that's interesting, important about the Accords is that they spur a competition for innovation within the constraints of the treaties. Britain was disproportionately affected because it had a 3-ocean navy. And the Accords, the United States forced the abrogation of the UK-Japan treaty. The British concluded this conference worked because the United States threatened to enter into an arms race with Britain and bankrupt her if Britain did not agree. British Prime Minister Lloyd George worried that Anglo-American military competition could become as invidious as that between Britain and Germany leading up to World War I. Even Winston Churchill believed Britain was about to, quote, drift into direct naval rivalry with the United States. That is, for both Britain and the United States, this was about naval primacy as much as anything else. And the agreements require hulls already laid for the Nelson and Rodney class ships had to be redesigned for smaller displacements to remain within Britain's apportionment. These would come to be referred to as the cherry tree classes because they were chopped down by Washington. What happens, what the British agree to the Accords because they understand that they don't have the economic strength to compete with the shipbuilding program of the United States, and that the US had grown strong enough that it could actually impose rules on Britain that Britain didn't want. That's why this is the transition in hegemony. Harding, in the conversations internal to his administration, when told that the British might balk, Harding says, "We'll talk sweetly and patiently to them at first, but if they don't agree, then we'll say, God damn you, if it's a race, then the United States is going to win it." Adam Tooze describes it as Britain's governments in the 1920s again and again found themselves confronting the painful fact that the United States was a power unlike any other. It emerged quite suddenly as a novel kind of superstate, exercising a veto over the financial and security concerns of the other major powers. So this is the point where the US begins to have the ability to do what great powers always try and do, which is shape the international order as a macrocosm of their domestic order. And everybody immediately starts scrambling to game the rules, right? changes in military capabilities that would become revolutionary were actually all begun in World War I. Combined armed tactics, submarine warfare, strategic bombing, carriers. But the interwar experimentation drove operational concepts that were essential to the effective utilization. For Japan, the Washington Accords affected threat perceptions, national strategy, technology, and military buildup, operational concepts tested by exercise, and importantly, the radicalization of the officer corps, with purges of accommodationist officers and even assassinations. For no other country was the impact as significant. Because of the Washington Convention, the Japanese government revised its national defense policy to accept war with the United States as inevitable and extended the radius of action to include offensive mid-Pacific intercept operations. The US rebuilt 9 of the 15 ships originally slated for destruction and improved existing ship classes with anti-aircraft and anti-torpedo defenses. Both Japan and America pressed forward with submarine development and utilization of shipborne aircraft, catapulting forward into carrier-based fleets. The 2 Lexington-class cruisers that were converted to aircraft carriers, which are often cited as evidence that America had the shift to carriers planned. But at the time of the Washington Naval treaties were being negotiated, the Department of the Navy had so low an opinion of naval aviation that it considered the conversion only, quote, slightly preferred to scrapping. And the American Navy remained under the carrier limit until 1933. What's so striking about the British is the adamancy with which the Admiralty remained committed to the battleship rather than shifting the Navy's fulcrum to the submarine or aircraft carrier, and their misfortune that removable armor proved less revolutionary than carrier-based aircraft. So what we see coming out of the Washington Naval Accords is that strategic failures are often failures of imagination. And what we should worry about is that in a time of a rising China challenge, the British Navy of the 1920s, so committed to the ways we know how to do things, that we are unwilling to innovate as fast as the changing strategic environment demands of us. And I'll stop there.
We really appreciated that. This is Emily's chance to come on board and give us her views.
Can you hear me okay? Hello, can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Okay. It's a real honor to be here today. When I wrote my dissertation over 30 years ago on the naval treaties, I never dreamed that I'd be able to comment on them at their 100th year anniversary. So it really has a special meaning for me. Let me just some general remarks that I think reinforce what Kori said, that the arms control treaties, the Washington treaties, by any arms control standard, they were an incredibly ambitious undertaking. Okay, they didn't confine themselves to controlling just the armaments of war, but they tackled a broad range of military, political, and economic issues in the Asia-Pacific region, which was the area of greatest global rivalry between the wars. They were a part of an evolving post-war framework of international cooperation, which also involved the Covenant of the League of Nations and the Locarno Treaty. And they attempted to impose a global overlay of arms control as part of constructing this new world order. One of the, I think, most enduring concepts behind it was the fact that the delegates acknowledged that weapons alone do not create conflict. Okay, this was arms control. This was not disarmament. When Secretary of State Charles Evan Hughes's bold initiative to restructure the global balance of naval power based on a 10-year naval holiday, when he proposed this, it set the stage for a series of multilateral discussions that first of all, established the foundation of a post-war order based on the cooperation of the two superpowers of the interwar period, the US and Britain. As Kori argues, it led to the peaceful evolution of British naval supremacy to Anglo-American parity. It created a new regional balance of power in the Pacific with the 5-power treaty ratios plus the non-fortification clauses for bases in the Western Pacific, therefore creating defensive superiority in respective spheres of interest. It orchestrated a series of political understandings in the Far East to support that naval balance of power, dissolving the Anglo-Japanese alliance, passing the 4-power treaty where each respected the rights of the others and their insular possessions in the Pacific and prevented the combination of any two, Great Britain, US, or Japan, against a third without an alliance, which was a major demand of the United States. And then the 9-power treaty as well on general principles of behavior with respect to China. It also tried to tie the European naval balance of power to the Pacific balance of power through ratios, thereby establishing a global naval balance of power. So it was an incredibly ambitious undertaking, and we should recognize that for what it was when we evaluate the evolution of it throughout the 20s and into the 1930s. As I said, I think that it's significant in its own right because it was not idealistic. It recognized that disarmament was not attainable and that was really critical to shifting how we think about arms control. What I want to drill down a little bit more in my time is to think of the Washington treaties as a pivot point in the evolution of naval strategy and doctrine. Kori mentioned the fact that the 1920s were were a period of immense technology disruption, air power, submarine, radar, that spurred innovation as militaries wrestled, as today, with how to leverage emerging disruptive technologies to defend and advance their interests. And in certain ways, the Washington treaties themselves shaped the evolution of that interwar innovation. First of all, they created the incentive for carrier development in the United States, the motivation to go full steam ahead with carrier development. How is the US going to project power to defend its interests in the Far East, given the 5-power treaty, the limits on the fortification of insular possessions in the Western Pacific, coupled with the fact that there were no limits on land-based air that Japan could use from the islands that had been mandated to it at the end of World War I. Fleet aviation centered on the carrier concept offered a way for the US to remedy this deficiency within treaty limits. So that's the first way that it directly shaped the innovation that followed. Second, it influenced the type of carriers, and that in turn spurned new ways to employ them. So treaty restrictions on carrier displacement, 23,000 tons, made it impossible for designers to provide sufficient flight deck armor to repel dive bomb attacks. And so this was a really important consideration in the decision to detach the carrier from the battle fleet and to adopt a doctrine of operating carriers independently with the aim of preemptively destroying the enemy carriers. It also freed up large hulls of battle cruisers for conversion to carriers. Naval designers regretted the immense size of these converted carriers, 36,000 tons displacement, but once they were in service, they revealed unexpected advantages. They were more adaptable to evolving aircraft. They permitted experimentation with new carrier tactics, and it allowed for the evolution of mass carrier attacks, which were so successful during World War II. The exercises that were conducted between the wars with the Lexington and Saratoga allowed the US Navy to learn about the value of large carrier groups, that they were faster than the rest of the fleet and they could operate independently with their own screen of heavy cruisers. And this led to the establishment of the concept of independent carrier task forces, and similar developments were occurring as well in Japan. So it was just by the chance that it created this opportunity to do experimentation, which would never have been possible without that. A third way is that more generally, the treaties spurred innovation in tactics and strategy. The blue water navies and command of the sea dominated the thinking in the US, Britain, and Japan. And that was a major reason why they were able to agree upon a basic unit of national power. As a result, limitations focused on the battleships and big guns as the index of naval power, while many other capabilities escaped extensive limitations, if any at all. So what Japan did was, in order to offset the inferior battleship ratio, they devised a strategy to wage an attrition campaign against the US fleet as it crossed the Pacific. They were determined to employ high-speed submarines with greater range and more reliable oxygen-propelled torpedoes. They perfected the tactics and strategy of submarine warfare, improved their ability to conduct reconnaissance and track the US fleet, and also devised concentration tactics for submarines as their forces made this transition from a reconnaissance to an attrition attack in packs against the US fleet. By the mid-1920s, the Japanese had more ocean-going submarines than any other navy, with a higher speed and cruising radius than the US and Great Britain. And the long-range torpedoes enabled the Japanese to basically attack in relative safety and at night to create confusion among the American fleet and tactical advantage. So these developments were really a direct outgrowth of the Washington treaties. Japan had to find a way to compensate for its inferior capital ship ratio, innovated with submarines, destroyers, torpedoes, and the attrition strategy to employ them. For the United States, the Washington treaties created the strategic dilemma of power projection. Coupled with the accident of large converted battle cruiser hulls, it contributed to the evolution of carrier doctrine, carrier strategy, the tactics to achieve air superiority once the Philippines were lost, which the US anticipated. And then those innovations brought together with innovations in long-range logistics, fueling at sea, and amphibious landings led the Americans to overcome the tyranny of distance, which was enshrined within their War Plan Orange. So this was a tremendous amount of innovation, which would have occurred, I believe, anyway, given the nature of these disruptive technologies, but the treaties really shaped the course of how that evolved. Let me conclude with just a few comments about the success or failure and lessons for today. The folklore is that the treaty system, and I include within that the London treaties, failed because they didn't prevent World War II. I would argue the 1920s were relatively peaceful. The treaties locked in the status quo in a key arena of great power competition, China. It kept the open door in place. It allowed trade, but not colonization or the occupation of China. So it really represented the demise of imperial diplomacy in the Far East. It was designed with a particular set of problems in mind, essentially resolving the security dilemma between friendly powers. And it was relatively successful until the rise of Nazi Germany, civil war in China, and economic depression. So the success in the 1920s should be appreciated for what it was, and to understand as well that part of the reason that occurred was because the treaties at the Washington Conference were tied with a series of interlocking political and economic arrangements. If you go into the 30s, by the 1930 and then the 36 London treaties, and even the Anglo-German Naval Treaty, those all only focused on the weapons of war, not the underlying conditions that were creating that. So I think, that is sort of the legacy of how I see the treaties. And I believe that one of the other key takeaways is the very difficult challenge of limiting new disruptive technologies, which we are seeing today. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Emily, that was very, very, very fine. For those who received the Naval War College Review, the latest October issue, the second article in it is based tremendously on Emily's work, also cites Kori. You might find that of interest. And if you don't have a copy, just email me. We'll get you a copy of that. Now for Carlos.
All right. I want to thank you for taking a few minutes here, but first of all, I want to address that something that our host today, Sam, had talked to about Secretary Lehman. He remembered the Navy before Lehman came in and after Lehman came in, and he talked about some good things going on. But one of the things I remember from being out in the fleet was the refrain that the Soviets were not 10 feet tall, they were 7 feet tall. And that 10-to-7 ratio, I don't know if it's an artifact of the Washington Conference, but Lehman also talked about personnel and people who can make decisions. And that struck me because, as Kori said, it's a milestone for the world, so to speak. But one of the persons that was often overlooked during the lead up to the treaties and the treaties themselves is the Japanese naval representative, Kato, the elder Kato. And I think he serves as a role model for future planners. For those of you who don't know it, he's often regarded as the father of the 8-8 fleet, but I referred to him last year as the killer of the 8-8 fleet because he finally made that decision that Japan could not, in an atmosphere of total warfare, pay the price to keep up with the United States and or Britain. But Kato's career is interesting because in 1914, he was going to be the naval minister, but he refused because he insisted that the Japanese must pursue the 8-8 fleet policy. And his goal was to bring down the Japanese government. So this is a senior Japanese Navy type who says, I won't be it. But a year later, after World War I starts, he's in the government for the next 7 or 8 years. And he has that gradual evolution where he does see the 8-4, the 8-6, and then finally in 1920, where he gets a title, the father of the 8-8 fleet. He gets success in the parliament. But a year earlier, he had started to recognize the cost of mobilization of total war. And he started to realize these very issues that we're talking about. How do you pay for something? How do you deal with future planning? And he started that gradual evolution of we can't pursue the 8-8 fleet without going bankrupt. And weapons programs and fleet programs are very expensive, as John Lehman was talking about. You had to remember we were trying for 600 ships in the 1980s. And Sam, I don't know if you remember how many ships we actually built, but there was nowhere near 600 ships by the end of the Cold War. And I think Kato, who is not really recognized in the Western world, served as an example of what Secretary Lehman was talking about promoting individuals who have the ability to influence and shape plans. So when Kato is going to go to the Washington Conference, he steps aside temporarily as the Minister of the Navy, and Prime Minister Hara takes over. Hara was the first commoner to rule Japan as prime minister. Unfortunately, Hara was assassinated right before the conference, but they had the luck of having somebody else come in and serve as an interim. And Kato served as a great break on the fleet faction because the younger Kato was dead set on achieving parity or supremacy. In fact, for those of you who know about the younger Kato, the Washington Conference, he supposedly exclaimed, "Now war starts between the United States and Japan." And so when Lehman was talking about moving people and personnel into the fleet, and again, I think Sam was recognizing that Lehman did make a significant change from what I guess the post-Vietnam Navy to the modern era, so to speak. Kato represented the other direction. Instead of pursuing these massive fleets, he pursued peace, and the trade-off was the non-fortification. And as Kori said, sometimes we don't recognize those who shape and do these processes. The other thing I wanted to point out, I think, Kori, you mentioned about President Harding. I'm just 40 miles from where he was born, and they have his house as a museum there. So, but anyway, I just wanted to make those comments, and thank you.